Hello everyone and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. After what seems like a very long while, happy holidays to you all. I hope you had some of them. And also, Happy New Year, because New Year is tomorrow and we'll take yet another hiatus there, come back on Friday, and from there on out, it is back to regularly scheduled programming. But for now, I'm recording this show, so hopefully you get the chance to see this one, but it should be a good one because we're kind of transitioning from fantasy football talk to more out there sports, so to speak. We're talking a lot more about, say, college football, basketball, if there are any fantasy basketball fans out there, and perhaps even hockey. I know the rise in popularity of that particular fantasy sport. So we're going to see a lot of different segments here on the show moving forward into the new year. But for now, we have an exciting Monday show here concerning tonight's Monday Night Football game, Lions 49ers. A lot of interesting debates and storylines concerning this one. And then from there on out, I'm going to be doing a betting preview of all four of these college football playoff quarterfinals, from Ohio State, Oregon, all the way down to Texas, Arizona State. A lot of good stuff going on in the college football world right now, so we'll have you up to date there. But before we get into any of that good stuff, I do want to remind you, consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show and the network if you want more content such as this. And even though the stream is recorded, I will remind you again that you can contribute and interact with the show in many different ways, not just through the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Featured stickers here on YouTube, but also through our website, GSMCpodcast.net, where you can do one of two things: either leave a tip or donation, which is greatly appreciated by all concerned, or leave a question, comment, concern you have about any show here that we do. I greatly appreciate all your input here that makes the show that much better, and it's greatly appreciated by all the other shows as well, because there are a lot of good people at this network doing a lot of good things. But without further ado, let us get into the first segment of the day here. Monday Night Football preview of Lions 49ers, and this is a very bizarre game here, because I could have told you before the season that this Week 17 matchup could have been for the number one seed, for better positioning in the playoffs. But here we are, and this game kind of means nothing right now. And a lot of interesting debates have arisen concerning this game as well, because when we look at the meaning of this one, the Lions, if they win, they go into next week knowing that they just need to win again. If they lose, they go into next week knowing that they just need to win against the Vikings to secure the NFC's number one seed. Whereas the 49ers, surprisingly, win or lose, it doesn't matter to them, because they are officially eliminated from the playoff race. And those words seemingly should not have come out of my mouth, because everyone believed at the start of the season the 49ers would be NFC West favorites to go back to the Super Bowl, and certainly in a game of this magnitude would play with pride and meaning. But now, only one of these teams truly has anything to quote-unquote play for here in Detroit. But here's the interesting thing here. Like I said, no matter win or lose, Detroit still has that chance at the NFC's number one seed. Now, the moral debate here is, do the Lions rest their starters for tonight's game, knowing that a loss doesn't hurt them? Or, under the borderline crazy, shall we say, leadership of Dan Campbell, they just go all in here and try and win both games? Consider this fact, though. 19 Detroit Lions are on the injured reserve list, including a myriad number of them on that very depleted defense. So, a break would be well-deserved for a lot of these players, as it gives them another week to rest on a short week, mind you, and it gives them opportunity to start planning for the playoffs, no matter which seed they get. Because if you do get the NFC's number one seed, home field advantage is great. But if you drop to the 5 seed, it's not necessarily that horrible, but you do have to plan a lot differently for going on the road. Or actually being at home, but having to play an extra week early, for that matter. But for Detroit, I think when we look at the culture and brand this team has built, they really are becoming much like the San Francisco 49ers were. They're trusting draft picks. They're a young, exciting team. And they don't really have these big brand names as superstars to lift their team. They just play as a collective, and the product on the field as a result is impressive. Whereas if you look at everyone around the NFC, I do feel like there are teams. The Eagles just proved it yesterday with two different quarterbacks. Tanner McKee, who had never played a snap in his life, and Kenny Pickett, looking for any chance at rejuvenation in the NFL, played brilliantly, showing that they can go 3 deep if needed at the QB position. Then the Vikings, very impressive win. Yes, kind of letting the Packers creep back into that one, but ultimately tying it up there with that impressive third down catch by Akers. So there are teams in the NFC well designed to take down this Detroit Lions team, but the Lions, what matters to me about them is their collective mindset. No matter who is on that football field, they play for Dan Campbell, they play for their offensive or defensive coordinators, and most ultimately they play for each other. And that's what I love about this team. No matter the challenges they will almost certainly face to get back to at least the NFC Championship on the NFC side of things. Now let's talk about this disappointing 49ers squad, on the other hand. I feel like this 49ers squad was not far off from at least competing for a playoff spot, because this season was about the very minute details, right, for this 49ers squad. Yes, you could talk about the injuries, which were a big deal, and potentially not something as minute as, say, red zone woes or Brock Purdy's decline or things of that nature, but injuries definitely played a major role as to the 49ers' downfall this season. But what I do think a lot of people don't understand with this 49ers team is that when everyone is healthy, sometimes even in that situation, there are so many mouths to feed that it can get complex. And a lot of people thought that during that midpoint of the season, when they were getting a lot of people back, including McCaffrey, that a lot of their woes to start the season would ultimately be amended by McCaffrey's return. That wasn't the case, because I feel like once those little details were ingrained into this team, these negative details that really separated themselves from the rest of the NFC, I feel like that's when the 49ers ultimately couldn't overcome them, no matter who was on the football field. And it's not an indictment of who they are as a football team. They're still an elite football team somewhere in this mess of a season. But it is going to get a lot harder because of the fact that now all of these young players are coming off their rookie contracts, Brock Purdy included, looking for a big deal. And then you have guys like, I believe Debo is going to be up. A lot of defensive players are going to be up as well. Guys like Ufanga and Ward. So, for that reason, we could see a lot of movement from San Fran in the offseason. Whether it's good movement or bad movement is going to be determined by these last couple of games. Because if they show heart and pride in these last couple of games, then I do feel like this team certainly has the exoskeleton needed should they lose a couple players in the offseason. But what I think about when I think about the 49ers right now is the little things. And I'm not necessarily certain that this team can overcome a lot of little things should there be a mass exodus. And I don't necessarily think there will be, because they still have the head coach, they still have the GM, and they still have, for the most part, a large core of those players who've got you to this point. But the time is ticking. The window is closing. The NFC is getting better and better. The Vikings, the Eagles, the Commanders even. Both the Seahawks and the Rams are most likely going to end up with better records than you. So, 49ers had to look at themselves squarely in the face here and for the last 2 games this season, try and make amends. Try and play with pride, because that's all you're playing for right now. Whereas the Detroit Lions are just playing to play. That's what I think about the Detroit Lions. They're not playing for any large goal right now. They're playing to play the game of football, which is an interesting concept when you think about it, but it is one that is rooted in the culture that Dan Campbell has built here. And it's a special one. And speaking of betting odds here, looking at Detroit minus 3.5, some might be tempted to take San Fran, and I actually wouldn't be mad at that. But I do think that Detroit does ultimately win this game. Whether or not they cover, I'm not necessarily certain of. But ultimately, I do think that Detroit right now is just playing to play the game of football. And no matter how badly they play, they might have a chance to win. Or how good they play, they might be in a rock fight. So this is going to be an interesting game here. But I have to take Detroit just because I'm not certain the 49ers are going to be willing to ultimately pick up the pieces of the season and try to win these last 2 games, because they might want to reassess themselves over this offseason and try and piece together a team moving forward that can get them back to the pedestal, because clearly they're not that far off, right? It's just that a lot of different circumstances came into play this season, and that's the reason for why they are where they are. But I am taking Detroit in this one. Also, speaking of money line, San Fran is plus 160, Detroit minus 190. Make of that what you will. But we are just about to take a short break here in the show, and coming back is going to be all college football playoffs, starting off with that rematch in the Rose Bowl between Ohio State and Oregon. Should be an interesting matchup. Going to have you covered all things betting right after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everybody, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you that even though this is a recorded show, there are still very many ways you can contribute and interact with it outside of the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube when this show is live. You can also go to our website, GSMCpodcast.net, or you can do the same things as you can do on YouTube, leaving a tip or donation, or also leaving a question, comment, or concern you may have about the show or any of the shows here across the network. It is greatly appreciated by all, and this makes this show that much better, and all the other shows around the network appreciate it in return as well. But without further ado, let's jump into our College Football Playoff Quarterfinal previews. We are really in the thick of this 12-team field here. We're really going to separate the wheat from the chaff here, and I'm really excited about this game in particular here for our second segment. Even though the 7th seed disparity might seem intimidating, this is a heavyweight matchup, and it's a rematch of an October 12th matchup that might as well have been the best game of the college football regular season. Yes, I'm talking about Ohio State versus Oregon. I talked about the 7 seed disparity. Yes, Ohio State being the 8th seed due to that weirdly heartbreaking loss to Michigan. Oregon, the only undefeated team in the land, taking the 1 seed. And perhaps that Ohio State victory was kind of the turning point in the season for Oregon, because up to that point, Oregon had a couple of shaky outings against one of the teams in the field, Boise State, that they would potentially face in the championship game. That would be a long shot, but it would be a very exciting rematch there as well, and then Idaho obviously in the season. But this game for Oregon in that regular season meeting seemed to be kind of the statement, because they were the newest Big Ten member. They won it their first time around, and they wanted to prove a statement against Ohio State before anything else, and they ultimately did. But to Ohio State's credit here, it could have been a win, but it ultimately came down to one mistake made by a veteran QB who is going to have to step up, much like he did against Tennessee, Will Howard. And looking at this game, I'm going to talk about a couple keys within this game as well as give you the betting perspective here. But ultimately, that's what I think it's going to come down to. Which team can limit the damage done? So without further ado, let's talk about it. Ohio State actually enters as a 2.5-point favorite in a game that in the regular season was decided by 1. So you can see a little bit of the discrepancy here. Still not ultimately budging on Ohio State being the favorite after that a heavy favorite rather, after that impressive win over Tennessee. They're still kind of giving respect to Oregon here as the number 1 seed. But still, Vegas is indicating that this is going to be another tough affair for the Ducks here. The over-under 54.5. Money lines, Ohio State minus 130. Oregon plus 110 here. So as you can see, kind of swinging in the favor of Ohio State here. And I'm not necessarily surprised, but there are a couple of key things that I think we have to diagnose here in determining the outcome of this game, because both of these teams are spectacular and they proved it on October 12th. But ultimately, there are a few little things that I think could separate them on the day. Let's start off, I believe, with Ohio State here. And I think the key to victory is simple. Will Howard cannot have boneheaded mistakes. He needs to stay on schedule, and he needs to ultimately play like he did against Tennessee, because that was his best game as an Ohio State Buckeye. After that loss to Michigan, after week of uncertainty over their playoff positioning, whether or not they would even make the playoffs, they ultimately get in. They face Tennessee in what many people thought would be the most even of those first round matchups, and ultimately blow them out of the water at the Horseshoe in a dominant performance where Will Howard looked completely in rhythm. He looked like the veteran quarterback we know him to be, and he proved that he can just distribute the ball to all these different weapons and ultimately not make mistakes. He was slinging the rock to both Jeremiah Smith, Emeka Egbuka, even Cardinal Tate had a couple of impressive catches in this one. So ultimately, Will Howard proved that he can be competent. But going up against Oregon in this rematch, he's going to have to stay on schedule as long as possible, because Oregon is bringing in a guy who did not play in this game on the defensive side of the football in Jordan Burch. And a lot of good things have been said about Jordan Burch this season, even in his absence here. And then combine that with the emergence of Matayo Uyunglele along this front as well. And you will have a very potent defensive front that can make things very challenging for Will Howard, because if you bring pressure, chances are that's when Will Howard is at his most vulnerable. And so Will Howard's just going to have to stay in that rhythm he found against Tennessee for as long as possible. Get the ball out quickly, I believe, because if you get the ball out quickly, it keeps this Oregon defensive front on its toes and forces these semi-weak linebackers and secondary, even though they're still a very strong unit, force them to think a little bit more about their decisions. Force Dan Lanning to kind of have to adjust to your game plan rather than adjusting to his. Because if you get behind schedule, Oregon's ready to pounce. And so that's why I think the ultimate key for any Ohio State success in this one, and ultimately an upset victory here, in my opinion, even though they are favored in this matchup, is to limit the mistakes made by the quarterback, Will Howard. And I think he's ultimately capable of it, because I've seen his ascendancy in the Big 12 when he was the Kansas State Wildcats quarterback. I've seen what he can be at his best, but I've also seen the mistakes he makes in critical moments, and I know that those could come back to bite him. But if he ultimately stays out of that territory and keep this Ohio State Buckeyes offense on schedule, then chances are we could be looking at an upset here because we know what this Ohio State defense can do as well. So it's going to be all about Will Howard on the offensive side of the football, making plays and ultimately making critical decisions that won't hurt his football team. Then we go to the Oregon side of things because this is a very multifaceted team. We talked a little bit about this Oregon defense and what that defensive front can do for it. Let's talk a little bit about the Oregon offense here and their keys to victory. I do think that one of the special things about Oregon is their understated ground game here. Because when we look at Dillon Gabriel, one of, if not the best college football player statistically of all time. He could break, I believe it's Case Keenum's, I could be incorrect here, all-time passing yards record, and that's an impressive feat for someone who, has been around so many places, UCF, Oklahoma, now at Oregon, trying to win a national championship in his final year of eligibility. But ultimately, what I do like of the balance of Oregon stems from this very understated, like I said, ground game. Because when we think of Oregon, we definitely think about what Dillon Gabriel can do through the air. He can pass effectively in the short to intermediate areas of the field to both Tez Johnson and Evan Stewart. But I do think that because of the fact that Oregon's ground game goes a little bit understated, I think one of their keys to victory could be pounding the rock. Because you're going to have to neutralize this Ohio State front here. Because they have standing depth, especially at the linebacker position where they could go 4 or 5 deep there. And you really, through the air, have to pick and choose your moments. Because they have an excellent secondary led by Alabama transfer Caleb Downs as well. So, if you pound the rock early and often with a guy in Jordan James who might just be the most underrated running back in this entire 12-team field, then you have a good chance of neutralizing this Ohio State defensive front, because this is the number 1 defense in the nation and left in the playoff statistically that you're facing right here. And this is a team that, yes, you got 32 points against a couple of weeks ago, but are coming in with a vengeance right now. They're coming off a high where they really needed that game to get into the right mindset to come into this rematch here and try and make another game of it. Because looking at Ohio State, there are chances that Will Howard might struggle in this game. There are chances where, in critical moments, they might not have the right play on offense. But this Ohio State defense can more than make up for it. And if Oregon plays into their hands a little bit of the time, Dillon Gabriel might be passing the football a little too often, then Ohio State definitely has a chance at an upset, and a blowout one at that, if this Oregon offense can't come on schedule. So I say, for Oregon, you got to pound the rock with Jordan James. Because if you don't, then there's no rhythm, there's no on-schedule throws that Dillon Gabriel can make, and as a result, you might be playing catch-up a little bit here. So this is all about going up against their strength and trying to attack it at its core, because you can't beat Ohio State without balance. And as much as Dillon Gabriel has been one of those quarterbacks who is so savvy and intelligent and knows the throws he wants to make and knows the throws he might not be able to, I do think that there needs to be a balance and an intention with the way Oregon plays in this one. But now that we talk about the keys to victory, let's talk about ultimately my prediction in this one. It's going to be yet another high-scoring affair, in my opinion, because both of these teams are capable of breaking down the strengths of these opposing defenses. Like I said, Oregon has the run game to keep this offense in balance, and Ohio State has the defense to help compensate for any mistakes this offense might make. And so I do feel like, though, at the end of the day, when I look at Oregon and I look at how multifaceted they can become on the offensive side of the football, where if you do get this run game in rhythm, Dylan Gabriel can pick you apart. He is savvy and intelligent enough to understand the complexities of this Ohio State defense and really attack him at the core, unlike any quarterback really can. And so that's why I have to pick Oregon against the spread here, even though, it's really tempting when you can think about this rematch to pick Ohio State, but I have to pick Oregon here just because, like I said, they can win this game in so many different ways, and I just think that Will Howard might just make a couple more mistakes in this one than we're accustomed to seeing from him. And this is not an indictment of him as a quarterback, it's just something that I've diagnosed in his game that I can't get out of my mind. Because in a critical moment, who's to say that Will Howard will find a way to overcome those decisions? So that's why I have to pick Oregon here, just because their strengths just seem a little bit better than Ohio State's at this point. But coming up next, out of this short break, we diagnose an even more intriguing matchup, the 7-2 Georgia-Notre Dame, and all the storylines that come with it right after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And for our third segment of today's show, we're sticking with the College Football Playoff Quarterfinal talk and transitioning over to the 7-2 matchup. Certainly does not feel like a 7-2 matchup though, between Georgia and Notre Dame. And this game, over the past couple of weeks, with all the talk and rumors about a certain Georgia player, has gotten a lot more interesting. And we now know the complex path Georgia has in this game going up against a Notre Dame team that's hotter than anyone in the country. Because for the first time in quite some time, Georgia will be sans Carson Beck. Because after that elbow injury in the SEC Championship game, after having season-ending surgery, he actually decided that he played his final game in the SEC Championship and is declared for the 2025 NFL Draft. So, the fate of Georgia rests solely on the shoulders of young Gunnar Stockton, a former 4-star recruit in the 2022 cycle, thrust into the spotlight against a Notre Dame team that might just be, like I said, the hottest team in the country after a bizarre loss to Northern Illinois. And in this matchup, I'm really looking at how Georgia can compensate for that discrepancy here. Because if this were Carson Beck, I'll be looking a little bit more at how in the passing game, at least his accuracy and rhythm could have kept the Bulldogs on schedule. Now with Gunnar Stockton, from the limited action we have seen him in, especially in that SEC Championship game, he does appear to be a little bit more mobile than Carson Beck in some situations, a little bit more willing and amenable, for that matter, to attack in that manner. And he might just have to, because when I think about Georgia's run game, it has been a little bit short of what we thought it would be in terms of supplementing and complementing the quarterback position. Because Trevor Etienne is one of those guys who, when he's in the open field, can make big plays, but he certainly isn't someone who I would completely and utterly rely upon if my season were on the line. And that goes for Nate Frazier as well. For as impressive a season as he had, he has been someone who I can completely trust as a player of youth in this team when you're going up against a juggernaut like Notre Dame. So for Georgia, this game is going to be all about this defense. Can Michael Williams, can Jalen Walker, can all those guys make big plays against this Notre Dame smash-mouth physical attack? And then for Notre Dame, there are a lot of things that I really like about this football team, but there are a lot of things that could come back to bite them. When I think about the things that I like about this football team, I like that this is a very smash-mouth physical brand of football play by Notre Dame on the offensive side, because you have two running backs in Jadarian Price and Jeremiah Love who can really, at its core, take over a football game unlike any other running back duo in the nation. They just force you to bring them down. They just force your defensive front to move with them. They force linebackers to make sideline-to-sideline tackles. They tire down defense, is what I'm saying. And that could be very integral to ultimately trying to get this win here. And so I do feel like when it comes down to who on offense can move the ball better, I'm actually leaning slightly towards Notre Dame, even though Georgia's defense has proven that it can stop the run against a team in Texas who has really looked impressive with the run game these past couple of weeks. And so that could be something that comes back to bite Notre Dame, which is why I'm so puzzled about how to think about this game from an offensive standpoint, because it could be very low scoring here. And I do think that the difference could come down to which of these two teams establishes the run game for two quarterbacks who, for the most part, would be most comfortable with their teams winning the football. And this is an indictment of Gunnar Stockton, who we really haven't seen, or Riley Leonard, who ultimately thrives in this kind of offense. But I do think that these quarterbacks are not going to be as integral to their team's success as these run games, because when I think about these defenses, they're going to want to key in on the run. Also, when you look at Notre Dame's defense, they also have a secondary to back it up. So, really, when I think about what Georgia's going to have to do and what Gunnar Stockton's going to have to do to make sure that everything's on schedule, I do think that he has a much bigger challenge here. Because let's go over to the Notre Dame quarterback side of things, because Riley Leonard is someone who, yes, may not be the best passer in college football, but he certainly can exploit defenses when that run game is going. He thrives on being efficient. He thrives on taking his chances when they're presented to him. He thrives when, most importantly, this running back duo is going. And that's what I think could be the difference here. Because with inexperience and Gunnar Stockton on the other side, chances are Georgia's going to have to rely on this defense. If this defense gets over-aggressive, that will play right into Notre Dame's hands here. Because they feel like they can establish the run game, they feel like they could potentially win in the trenches, and ultimately, Riley Leonard can be the difference here. Should you know, all you have to do is be on schedule. And so that's why I think in this matchup, I'm really not necessarily looking for any modicum of consistency out of these quarterbacks. I'm looking for efficiency, because efficiency is what's going to win this game. It's not going to come down to, consistently hitting your short to intermediate routes. It's not going to come down to explosives. It's going to come down to who can take the opportunities when they're presented. And I think Riley Leonard might just be the better one at that. But let's go to the Notre Dame defensive side of things, because certainly this is a defense that on paper is quite similar to what Georgia can bring to the table, but does also have a loss within its ranks. Linebacker Riley Mills could be out for the season as well, and he is a big part of the run stop and also in terms of coverage, because a lot of what Notre Dame's defense's success has stemmed down to has been that ultimate balance on all three levels. Their front's been getting home. Their secondary has been covering very well. A lot of sticky coverage within that Notre Dame secondary. But I also think that when you lose a player of Riley Mills' magnitude, I think a lot of attention's now going to fall on this secondary as well. Because I do think that at some points, Georgia might be forced to pass the football a little bit more than they would like. And so it's going to be about, can Notre Dame really, in those kind of vulnerable moments, find the right coverages to where Gunnar Stockton really can get into a rhythm, much like Texas really did in that SEC championship game. because I do feel like Gunnar Stockton wouldn't necessarily be in this position of trust had none of this Georgia staff believed in him. They're going into this saying that Gunnar Stockton is highly capable of winning this football game for them. And they're probably going to have a game plan that shows as much against the Notre Dame defense that has had vulnerable moments this season. But I do think that if Gunnar Stockton is forced to pass a little bit more than he would like and this Georgia staff would like, then Notre Dame's secondary comes to the fore. And so that's why I think that this Notre Dame defense should be okay in terms of compensating for that loss of Riley Mills, because if they had a weaker secondary, then perhaps this would spell trouble for them. But I do think that ultimately they have a lot on the back end and still in the defensive front that can compensate for that kind of loss in that linebacking core. But then, looking at this game from a prediction standpoint, because Georgia is ultimately the 2-point favorite here. The over-under is 44.5, UGA minus 130, Notre Dame plus 110, and this actually, bear in mind, was written a couple weeks ago, so it could have gone in Notre Dame's favor a little bit, and I would not have been surprised, because everything on and off the field seems to be very much in their favor. Ultimately, what this could come down to is coaching experience as well. Because remember, Kirby Smart has been in this position before, with a guy very much like a Gunnar Stockton, when you really think about the trials and tribulations he has gone through when Stetson Bennett, who really was not necessarily the most miraculous of QBs, but yet led Georgia to their first title in over, 30, 40 years. And so it's not like Kirby Smart hasn't been in this situation before. 6-2 overall in the college football playoffs. And then when you look at Marcus Freeman, he has had a very illustrious tenure so far with this Notre Dame Fighting Irish team. And so I do feel that that experience could come back to hurt this Notre Dame team, just because I can't necessarily count out Kirby Smart. But from this analysis, from what this off-the-field situation has brought to the forefront for Georgia, from what I've seen out of Notre Dame ever since that loss to Northern Illinois, as being one of the hottest teams in the country, playing a brand of football that you simply can't slow down, I think that I have to pick Notre Dame, whether against the spread, like I said, not necessarily certain of, or with the spread. I do feel that this game is Notre Dame's to lose right now, because they have all the momentum, they have the tact that they need on both fronts, and they ultimately have the more efficient quarterback. Because I'm not sure if that run game for Georgia can get going, the Gunnar Stockton can pass them to victory. So that's why I ultimately have to take Notre Dame here, just because when I think about the structure of these teams, I just think Notre Dame has built for this moment a little bit more than Georgia, who is simply now going to have to try and cover the tracks, really, with Gunnar Stockton. I don't necessarily know what the contingency plan will look like, and that's the ultimate reason why Notre Dame is my pick here. But ultimately, we're going to have to see on the football field when that game is played. But coming up next, for our fourth segment of the day, we'll talk about the New Year's Eve showdown between the 6 and 3 seeds, Penn State, Boise State. Very interesting game in that department as well. Be right back after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And for our fourth segment of the day, we are moving on to the 6-3 matchup. A lot of people calling this perhaps the most uneven matchup out of all these matchups here in the quarterfinals, but still a very exciting proposition here to talk about between Penn State and Boise State. Two starkly similar teams when we look at them from how they're structurally built, but ultimately one with a little bit more of an advantage. But looking at this game, looking at the large spread here, one in which Penn State could be the highest ever favorite, according to Vegas, ever in the bowl era, I do think that you can't necessarily count out Boise State, though. And there are reasons as to why this game could be a lot closer than I think, even if it's just a cover of the spread for Boise State here. So without further ado, let us break it down from the betting perspective and as to how both of these teams can pull out the victories. Let's start off with shocking 6th seed here, Penn State. Penn State are a football team that seem like they have a very uncertain identity. They can't necessarily decide what they want to be at any given time, but they've strung together wins in such an impressive manner that they have sneakily become a true dark horse contender here to win this entire thing. When I look at them, when I think balance, it is weird to think, but it's not necessarily cliche, because I love what they do on offense. I love the bringing in an addition of Andy Kotelnicki at the offensive coordinator position, and I love that Drew Aller has become a little bit more reliant on himself as a passer, and has really transformed what this offense can ultimately be able and be capable of doing. Because if it were like last year, and Penn State got into the field then with that same 11-2 record, I would not have thought highly of them. Drew Aller wasn't there yet. This run game, yes, was as spectacular as it was this season, but certainly not enough to really compensate for anything Penn State could have done defensively, even though their defense was pretty impressive last year. But now I see ultimate transformation, an ultimate shift in mindset and narrative here for Penn State, where they believe in this offense, Drew Aller believes in himself, and ultimately we're reaping the benefits. But if there is any one caveat, it's that Drew Aller is too over-reliant on a certain target here. And not that Tyler Warren can't carry this team to the promised land. This man can do anything. And he literally has done everything for this Penn State offense this season. But I do think the best we've seen of Penn State is this reliance on keeping Drew Aller in rhythm and ultimately finishing people off with this balanced running attack between Nicholas Singleton and Katron Allen. That's where we've seen the best of this Penn State offense in rhythm. Because when you know Drew Aller looks competent, when he looks capable, when he looks comfortable, most importantly, that is when Penn State can really annihilate a football team. That's when Penn State can really key in on what makes them special. And that's when this confidence that people now have in this team can be realized. Because if Drew Aller hits a roadblock along the way, that's when I start to panic, because it certainly doesn't necessarily fall on his shoulders entirely, this offense, should you know they fall out of step, fall out of rhythm, but it comes down to Drew Aller keeping up this confidence in himself and the confidence the team has in reciprocity for him. Because I think that if this remains the formula for Penn State, a lot of people will find a hard time beating it. So that's why Penn State are now a hefty 11-point favorite in this game, even though, Boise State is a very weird 3 seed. But let's talk about them a little bit, because we can't necessarily disrespect them at this juncture. Because this Boise State team has been one of the best teams in the nation. Maybe not the third best team in the nation as their seed says they are, but certainly a team certainly competent enough to really make this a challenge for Penn State. Like I said, they could cover the spread here. I think this is a little of a lofty spread for a team in Boise State that really can keep on schedule here. And so when I look at both sides of the football for Boise State, yes, it's going to have to come down to the offensive play. It's going to have to come down to Ashton Jeanty here. And Ashton Jeanty, I feel like, is completely capable of running this Penn State defense and wearing it down, and ultimately relieving the pressure certainly placed on Maddox Madsen's shoulders at the QB position. But I can't necessarily shake the fact that Maddox Madsen is going to have to have a spectacular game. It's going to be a similar sentiment in our last segment when we talk about Arizona State as well. When we look at these two teams and where they fit in terms of the playoff landscape. They're both led, and I don't necessarily want to foreshadow my ASU portion of this next segment, but Boise State is led by an everyman running back. He really is what this offense is all about, and Maddox Madsen ultimately relies on him almost a little bit too much to carry them to the promised land. But I do think that Maddox Madsen is going to have to step up in certain moments, and it's going to be very difficult against a Penn State defensive front and secondary that's rounding into form after having 2 pick sixes against SMU quarterback Kevin Jennings, who was having a very impressive season up to that point in this situation. And so, looking at the ways in which a Boise State can win, look for Maddox Madsen to get the ball out very quickly. When I look at what Maddox Madsen can do, he's certainly a competent passer. He has accuracy in his game. He can get into a rhythm. It's not just about relying on Ashton Jeanty to pound the football 30-odd times. Maddox Madsen, if you can believe it, averages nearly 29 pass attempts per game. That's a pretty hefty number for a quarterback who is as over-reliant on his running back as Maddox Madsen is. But when I think about what this Penn State defensive front can do to him, with the pressures they can design, and what this Penn State secondary in the back end is capable of doing, when you look at a quarterback the magnitude of Maddox Madsen and compare him to what Penn State might have done against Curtis Rourke, or Kevin Jennings in the last game, he's going to definitely have a tough time. So look for this game to ultimately come down to the rhythm that Boise State can develop with a guy in Maddox Madsen who is going to have to be trusted a lot more often than not. And then the game plan for Penn State's defense is very much like it was against SMU, even though Maddox Madsen isn't as mobile as Kevin Jennings. Make him strictly a pocket passer. Force Maddox Madsen to throw the football to win. Because if Maddox Madsen throws the football a lot more often than normal, then Boise State's in trouble. Boise State's playing catch-up in that moment, and PSU certainly can cover this threat. Cover the spread. But I think that Penn State defensively isn't necessarily down to, just this defensive front. It's down to the secondary as well, because the secondary not only has the skill and the raw talent there to make this a blowout, but ultimately I do think that Ashton Jeanty can kind of neutralize that Penn State defensive front a little bit and potentially force this Penn State secondary to be hyper alert and hyper focused on slowing down the pass game from Maddox Madsen. That could lean into a Boise State advantage here, should Ashton Jeanty start to wear down this front and thus allow Maddox Madsen to potentially get into rhythm where the secondary was too hyper focused on stopping Jeanty in the first place. So that could play into Boise State's strengths, but ultimately Penn State had very few weaknesses on the defensive side of the football. So everything is going to have to be very perfect for Boise State's offense in this one if they have a chance. And for Penn State, offensively, I just think that all the things I talked about are what define this football team here. All the things about Drew Aller, all the things about this running game between Singleton and Allen, all the things about everyman Tyler Ward, all the things about what the addition of OC Andy Kotelnicki means for the squad has to translate to the football field. Because if it doesn't, and they come out a little bit slowly, then all the worry that this Penn State fan base had last year seeps back in. Because a lot of people after last season were not necessarily comfortable saying that Drew Aller was the guy moving forward. This season, he's kind of dispelled those rumors a little bit. But this is the quarterfinals of the College Football Playoff. And you're in a very favorable matchup here against a team that's definitely going to be up against it on the offense side of the football. But Boise State's defense can't be underestimated. Hassanin, Virgin Morgan, excellent pass rushers. And yes, it's going to be a difficult setting for them in this environment, but they can get home and pressure Drew Aller. And we haven't necessarily seen Drew Aller really face that much pressure in football games this season. And so once he comes under that pressure, he's going to have to really live up to this reputation as a 5-star athlete and really live up to his reputation as a Penn State starting quarterback, because ultimately he's going to have to keep this offense in rhythm here. It can't just all be on Singleton, Allen, and Warren in this one. It's going to have to come down to the play of Drew Aller and what he and offensive coordinator Andy Kotelnicki can cook up for this offensive game plan. But going into the prediction, looking at this hefty spread here, all in favor of Penn State, and looking at this over-under of 52.5, moneyline PSU minus 500, Boise plus 360, I have to go with Penn State here. And I certainly said that Boise State, or implied that Boise State could cover the spread, and they almost certainly can. But ultimately, I can't look past the fact that Penn State just has a lot more ways to win this football game. They're a bigger, stronger, faster team. And ultimately, Drew Aller may not even have to be the guy for Penn State in this one. He may have to make a couple of big plays, but ultimately, they have the offense and the defense to help compensate for any mistakes made by Drew Aller. They have contingency plans going for them in this one. So that's what is the difference for me here in this matchup. And even like I said, if Maddox Madison plays perfectly, if Ashton Jeanty wears down this Penn State defensive front, it's still going to be a mountain to climb trying to stop this Penn State offense for Boise State. So I have to pick Penn State here, even though it is a lofty spread, and I feel a little bit uncomfortable saying that. So I am going to take the risk here and take Penn State all in. But coming up to finish today's show is the 5-4 matchup, perhaps the most bizarre matchup out of all of them in the quarterfinals. Texas-Arizona State to finish today's show and finish the CFP quarterfinal preview right after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, and to close out today's show, we're talking about the 5-4 matchup, a pretty bizarre one here in the quarterfinal field as to these two teams' divergent paths in making it to this point. Texas, Arizona State. And this game certainly has a lot of storylines about how both of these teams got to this juncture. Texas as a first-time SEC member, and ASU as an unexpected Big 12 champion. But ultimately, I think that this game certainly has the players and talent to make it a very exciting one, unlike perhaps what many people in Vegas and outside think of this one as well. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Let's talk about these two teams' divergent paths before we get into our ultimate keys to victory for both of them and this betting preview here. Let's start off with the more unexpected of these two participants here, the Arizona State Sun Devils. Before the season, Arizona State was projected to be last in Big 12 play. And if you remember all the things that happened to Arizona State in the first half of this decade, the Herm Edwards tenure, the NCAA sanctions, what Kenny Dillingham walked through the door into these past couple of seasons, even having a guy like Jaden Daniels, losing him to LSU, watching him win the Heisman, and ultimately be one of the best rookie QBs of these past couple of years with Washington. Watching all of that happen to your football team, going into a new conference these past couple of years, and not being thought highly of, to now 4th seed with a bye into the college football playoffs. A 11-2 record as Big 12 champions is very impressive. So I have to applaud Kenny Dillingham, the Arizona State Sun Devils organization, and ultimately this very special football team playing some of the best football these past couple of weeks for this moment. Because a lot of people knew the Big 12 was going to be open, but not as open as potential last place projection to win this entire thing. And so I have to applaud this Arizona State Sun Devils team, even as a Texas fan. But speaking of Texas, let's talk about their impressive first season in the SEC. Only runners up there, losing twice to Georgia here. There are only 2 losses of the season for that matter, but still, running through the SEC like it's nothing. Yes, you can talk about them quote-unquote rolling out the red carpet for Texas by giving them a pretty easy SEC slate, but ultimately, you have to beat whoever in front of you, and Texas did that to a T. Got a pretty impressive win, their first ever CFP win against Clemson last week, and now they come into this matchup as a heavy favorite here. But I have to applaud them for their transition to the SEC, handling it with ease, and ultimately making seemingly other transition from Quinn Ewers potentially to Arch Manning next season look a little bit more easy in that department. But summing up this game is going to be pretty difficult here, because either this game is going to be as close as people think, or Texas just asserts its dominance, much like they did against Clemson here. But ultimately, there are some keys to victory for Arizona State that are as intriguing as what I talked about with Boise State as well, and I kind of alluded to talking about in this segment as well. So ultimately, talking about these keys to victory, let's start out with Texas though, because Texas are the better equipped team for this game. The number 3 defense in the nation, perhaps the best defense by many people's standards in the nation, if you look at it that way. And then an offense that certainly can play a brand of football that's very tough to stop when both of their running backs are on their game. When I look at the best ways to win the championship, which is what Texas ultimately wants, and especially in this game, keys to Texas victory here and from here on out are exploiting secondaries on intermediate routes. Because when I look at Texas, all the pressure is going to fall on Quinn Ewers' shoulders. They made the decision that Quinn Ewers is the guy going into the postseason. Quinn Ewers clearly could have declared for the draft, much like Carson Beckson, and said, you know what, go into this one with Arch, figure it out. But no, he came back, and he wants to go out with a bang for Texas, or at least to a new team with a championship to show them what he's all about. So, I think that in terms of making Quinn Ewers comfortable in this one, you gotta exploit that ASU secondary. They're the weakness on this football team for Arizona State, and I think that if you know, much like they did against Clemson, if Texas's run game is getting going, look for Quinn Ewers to exploit that defense, much like he did against Clemson, taking those intermediate routes, taking those rhythm routes over the linebackers and safeties for that easy yardage, because we know that that's where he's most comfortable. I think that a lot of people criticize him for not throwing the ball deeper or as accurately as they think he should. But ultimately, when I see the best of Quinn Ewers as a Texas fan, it's when he's in rhythm and when he's got his running game going. And I know it's kind of cliche to talk about with all these quarterbacks in this 12-team field relying on the run game a lot, but Quinn Ewers clearly does to a T, because he is one of those guys who can clearly take advantage of weakened defenses when his running game is going. And that's the best part of this Texas offense, when everything's in lockstep and Steve Sarkisian can call any play he wants and know that he's comfortable with his guys executing. And it's going to come down as well to this Texas offensive line, because this Texas offensive line has been very impressive in run protection. In pass protection over the past couple of weeks, maybe not. It might be down to Quinn Ewers holding on to the ball a little bit too long, but ultimately they're going to have to do a better job in that department if they want to win a championship. So another big part of what I want to see out of Texas against this ASU defense is that rhythm along the offensive side as well, from run protection into pass protection for Quinn Ewers. So that's ultimately going to be a big part of this game. But that's what I want to see, because if Quinn Ewers is not at his game in this one, then I start to worry a little bit about what this Texas team is capable of doing. Because their ceiling is very high, but their floor could fall out on them. Because this is ultimately the way that I think Texas' offense can ultimately win this entire thing. If Quinn Ewers gets in rhythm because of this run game. And looking at this Texas defense, they're certainly capable of giving him as many possessions as he needs to get into that rhythm. But if you don't get into that rhythm, and if your red zone offensive woes start to show up again, and this run game gets shut down potentially by this Arizona State defense, and nothing's really going right, then that's when you have to start to panic, because that's when Quinn Ewers isn't in rhythm, when nothing's going right. So everything has to fall into step for this Texas offense in the rest of these games, not just this particular one. But I would love to see Quinn Ewers really get back to his best football through the air, through those intermediate routes that he really loves. So that would be my key to victory for Texas. Then for Arizona State, it's quite simple. Cam Skattebo has to have the best game of his collegiate career, much like Ashton Jeanty has to do against Penn State. Cam Skattebo is certainly capable of that. Second only to Ashton Jeanty in terms of yards per scrimmage. First running back since 2016 to have 1,500 plus yards rushing and 500 yards receiving. So he really is one of those other everymen in these underdog teams here in the quarterfinal. But ultimately, when I look at the makeup of this ASU offense, they really did lose a lot when Jordan Tyson went down. And it's not like Sam Leavitt is going to be someone who's going to fall under the microscope very heavily, because you already know he's up against it, and he's still a very solid quarterback, only quarterback in the nation at that to have 20 plus touchdowns and commit less than 5 turnovers in this season. But I still think that Cam Skattebo has to be the guy, because he is someone who is capable of scoring all the points for this offense, and that this offense might need to keep up with Texas in this one. So I do think that Sam Leavitt's going to come into scrutiny, but it's not entirely his fault, because I do feel that if there needs to be a contingency plan, I don't necessarily think the AFCU staff will be well equipped to handle it, because that's really been their MO, to get Sam Leavitt in rhythm because of what Cam Skattebo can do. And he's certainly capable of breaking down a Texas defensive front that has at times looked very vulnerable against the run, if at that. But I feel like Sam Leavitt is someone who I just can't necessarily rely upon to get his team back in the game. And it really comes down to, well, looking at last week when Kay Klubnik really got his team back into the game. Can Sam Leavitt do the same? I don't necessarily think Sam Leavitt is Kay Klubnik, or he has the wide receiver core that can really elevate their games for him like Kay Klubnik had in that matchup. I think that Melquan Stovall is a talented guy, but he's not a 1,000-yard receiver, and you really don't have anyone outside of him to catch the football as effectively as a guy like Jordan Tyson did to really complement the run game and Skattebo. So this really hits home for ASU here, because you're faced with the reality that you're down your best weapon in the pass game, and Texas secondary is going to be out for blood in this one, trying to get back to their best after a little bit of a debacle against Clemson last week. So look for this game to ultimately come down to how much the load Cam Skattebo can really carry for this Arizona State offense. And then ultimately, looking at the prediction, yes, there's a huge discrepancy, much like there was between Penn State and Boise State here. Texas 14-point favorites. Texas minus 650 in terms of money line. ASU plus 425. The over-under 51.5. But I have to think that this Arizona State offense has a really special and unique way of breaking down that Texas defense, because this Texas defensive front has a lot of depth, a lot of experience. But I do think that at certain moments, if you have a competent ground game, chances are your quarterback doesn't have to do a lot against Texas. Because if Cam Skattebo really can have a legacy game like I said he can, then Arizona State can cover the spread. but I do think that Texas will just have enough to where the spread is covered, but only just barely. I'm actually going to stay on the side of what CBS Sports said and be kind of in the camp where Arizona State can score a couple touchdowns, get at least 21, 28 points even maybe, but ultimately Texas will just be bigger, stronger, and faster in this one and really impose their will, both through the air, I believe, with Quinn Ewers getting in rhythm off the running game as well, because I think that ultimately the ASU defense can stop Texas offense as many times as they need to for Cam Scadaboo to really make an impact as to where I go. This could be an upset. So that's why I have to take Texas here and this lofty spread, much like I did against Penn State, just because they are the better football teams. But let me know what you think in the comments after I record this show. But that will just about do it for this one. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been your host, Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. Like, follow, and subscribe to the show and the network if you so choose. Remember all the details I talked about concerning ways to contribute and interact through YouTube, the Super Chat, Super Things, and Super Stickers features, and their website, gsmcpodcast.net, if you so choose. But other than that, I'm out. See you again on Friday. But other than that, Happy New Year to you all as well. And we'll get back to regularly scheduled programming in the very near future.